Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Silent No More. Um, Forgive me, I am just testing out this new setup versus just using my phone, so hopefully it works out well. Because the story that I am sharing with you today is not my story. It is actually the story of a man, and um, for identity's sake, I am just going to call him Adam. Um, Not his real name by any means. Um, he's in his 30s. He had contacted me after seeing an article that I had reposted on my Facebook page that was about borderline personality disorder has the strongest link to childhood trauma. It was um, posted through medicalexpress.com. And it's something that I felt strongly about because it's one of the easiest ways for uneducated um, doctors, people in a hurry to miss the link to mistreating both the borderline personality disorder and the trauma, thus re-victimizing people, um, also not effectively helping them. Because if you have a patient with borderline personality disorder and they have childhood trauma, um, and you're not treating that childhood trauma or acknowledging that childhood trauma, um, the success of your patient, their life, their livelihood, their emotional health is going to be greatly diminished. If you effectively go back and treat that trauma, um, they're more than likely to function as if they don't have, like a person without borderline personality disorder. Um, and Forgive me here as I'm going through my notes, but I don't know how many of you are truly familiar with borderline personality disorder and what exactly it is. It Some people think it's not a serious enough label. Other people think it sounds really scary. Um, Essentially, the way our minds work, like if you think of our minds simply as this, we all have an emotional part of our brain. We all have a logical part of our brain. In the middle is what they call wise mind. That is essentially where you are thinking, functioning, acting, reacting to things using both your emotional part and both your logical part together. Um, and that's kind of the healthy way of doing things. People with borderline personality disorder tend to either be so far over to emotional or they're so far over to logical, without having that other piece in there that greatly impacts how they respond, whether it's over respond, under respond, to events around them in their lives. Don't know if you're familiar with this article or not. Like I'd mentioned, it's through medicalexpress.com. It talks about people with borderline personality disorder are 13 times more likely to report childhood trauma than people with any mental problems. And that is according to the University of Manchester research. And basically, it says the analysis of data from 42 international studies of over 5,000 people show that 71.1% of people who were diagnosed with these serious health condition were reported at least one traumatic childhood experience. And it says that basically, in the latest series of analysis by the team, the effects of childhood trauma on adult mental health showed as more likely to be associated with borderline personality disorder than mood disorders, psychosis, personality disorders. The most common forms of adverse experience reported by people with borderline personality disorder were physical neglect, followed by emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional neglect. It is definitely a debilitating mental health problem. It makes it hard for people to control their emotions and their impulses. Um, it's often linked to self-harm, substance abuse. It's hard to treat, especially if you don't know what you're dealing with. And it's costly to treat, to the person, to society, depending on when you catch this. Some of the characteristics of the condition are like experiencing extreme overwhelming emotions over what might seem to others to be a minor issue are common, but become chronic and exaggerated after childhood trauma. Um, Excuse me, I have a cold apparently. Anyway, it says they found a strong link between childhood trauma and borderline personality disorder, which is particularly large when emotional abuse and neglect was involved. Borderline is a slightly misleading term as it implies that this condition only has a mild impact. Far from that, BPD can be very distressing and difficult to treat. Basically, they hope that the findings of this report underline the importance of trauma-informed care. That is a huge thing. For people accessing mental health services where prevalence rates of BPD are high. So obviously, we need medical professionals to be, as it says, trauma informed. You need to know how to deal with somebody who has dealt with child abuse, domestic violence, assault, neglect, the whole gamut of basically what childhood trauma could entail. If you have somebody treating you or treating somebody who is not trauma informed, they're going to end up doing a great disservice to that person. Now, the story of Adam, like I said, falls into both of these categories. Adam started seeing a psychiatrist in Rochester, Minnesota, through Mayo, which is typically highly regarded. Mayo is the big place to go for his specialness, as a lot of people like to label him and call him. He's actually a very nice man, a very intelligent man. Stands out a little bit differently to other people, but a lot of people didn't bother to take the time to realize what that difference was. Anyway, as a child, he was sent to Dr. Eric, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Milliner. Like I said, who is a psychiatrist with Rochester Mayo. And basically, instead of really treating him, just labeled him and sent him on his way. And to quote him, they refused to acknowledge my childhood trauma. What childhood trauma are we talking about? We are talking about the fact that he witnessed domestic violence. He witnessed his father hurting his mother. He was also a victim himself, not only because of witnessing this, but he was abused as well. Basically, because of the borderline personality disorder, because of the non-acknowledgement of his trauma, and the issues that has caused with his mental illness, so to speak. I hate to use that term because I don't think of him as an ill person. His dream was to be in the army. But because he was mistreated, ignored, passed along, essentially silenced, he was separated from the army. He was not allowed to join. He could not fulfill his lifelong dream and has, struggled as an adult in his relationships, interpersonal, all of that because of this disorder and because his trauma has not been dealt with. Because nobody has bothered to sit down and say, hey, Adam, I hear you. You experienced something horrible. You witnessed something horrible. You should not have had to go through that. What happened was not okay. Please, if you're willing to, talk about it, and open up those doors of healing. He wanted to. He tried to. This Dr. Milliner from Rochester Mayo knew the abuse was going on. And he had every opportunity to step in and help him. He had every opportunity as a mandated reporter to do his due diligence, to follow his Hippocratic oath, to do no harm. He had the tools to, quote, cure him, and he didn't. Instead, he forced the legal medical equivalent of meth down his throat, which obviously, if that's not something that your brain requires, you're going to have some pretty nasty side effects. You also, that's a drug you have to be extremely careful with, in terms of how much you prescribe and when you prescribe it, because of side effects. And basically, um, his side effect with this was anger. And this doctor's response, instead of being like, wow, there is a problem here, or wow, this is a really bad side effect, was to complain. You should not be complaining about your patient's reactions to medications. You should definitely sympathize and empathize and understand them, but to be annoyed at them for having an issue with the treatment you prescribed is not only dumb, it's downright dangerous. That does not make you a good doctor. Um, and, as he worded to me, of course I'm going to flip out. This is what speed does to your brain. Makes sense to me. As he would say, it makes people stay awake for days. Then you flip out in anger. If you think about it in that sense, it actually really kind of makes sense. If you were up for days, might you have some emotional reaction? I probably would. I can't imagine being up for days and not having a problem. So because of this, he lost his career in the Army. He felt like, to quote Adam, Dr. Eric Milliner murdered me. We're not talking physically. Obviously, he's still alive, not accusing this doctor of murder. He murdered him psychologically. He murdered his mental health because he had a job to do and he was either not equipped to do it. I don't know this man. Or he just simply didn't want to do it. Neither explanation is good. Neither explanation is okay. It took a lot for Adam to come forward. Adam is somebody that I've known as an acquaintance for a very long time. Not super close by any means. Like I said, I always knew that there was something different about him, something that maybe bugged him. I think a lot of us trauma survivors tend to pick up on those little nuances from other people, something that somebody else who hasn't experienced trauma might be like, wow, that person's weird. Trauma survivors tend to go, I think there's something there. Because it's like this little embedded secret that you kind of, how your body is, and you start to recognize it in other people. But obviously, we weren't good enough. Like, I didn't know him well enough to just be like, hey, have you suffered trauma? Like, no. And it obviously wasn't something that he advertised for a lot of survivors. You carry guilt, you carry shame. You don't walk around waving a flag announcing to the entire world that you have this label or that you are a survivor of trauma. So he asked me to tell a story. That's why I'm sitting here with you. I did a little bit of research on Dr. Eric Milliner. I don't know how well you can see this. This is the doctor he was speaking to me about. Says he does, psychiatry and neurology. Like I said, Mayo Clinic. From what I could find on ratings for him from, WebMD, other sources where you can go and, put in a rating about a doctor, put complaints, is that not so great. Basically, from what I could gather, the very first appointment people have with him, they give him 3.5, 4-star rating. He acts like he's listening. He seems like he's kind of understanding. He gives you your diagnosis or label, whatever you'd like to call it. explains that diagnosis to you, then says, hey, I want you to try this medication, tells you why he wants you to try the medication. Him being a doctor, of course, you trust him and you go with it and you take it. The follow-up is where the problems begin. The problem there is that it doesn't seem like he does a lot of follow-up. That is where he gets a 1-star rating because, to quote some of these people, 0 stars isn't an option. This is where they've reached back out to him to say, hey, I'm having a problem with this medication. I'm having a side effect. I don't know if I should still be taking this, that they're not being heard. This is where, typically when you go to see a psychiatrist, and you're given a label, a diagnosis, and you're prescribed medications, you should be seeing them on a regular basis for follow-ups, whether that's, every couple of weeks, every month, every 3 months, every 6 months. So you can discuss things, make sure things are going okay. And that seems to not happen for a lot of people. It seems like, I know in Adam's case, and in the case of some of these online complainers, that was their issue. The follow-up care, and then the integrity of that follow-up care, that the caring that they got in that first appointment, the person who listened to them in that first appointment, the person who took time to explain things in that first appointment, was not the same person that they got in their follow-up care. That was more of the annoyance at their complaints, at their concerns, wanted to basically get him in, get him out the door. This is where, instead of talking to his patients, to understanding why they have this issue, this disorder, this mental illness, doesn't happen. This is where they come in and say, this medication is horrible for me. What other options do I have? That he's flippant about it. And a lot of times actually just keeps them on it. Which, if you're having severe side effects and they're not going away, if they're severely affecting your personality and your mood, any doctor worth 2 cents is going to look at that and say, this is a problem. Doctors are mandated reporters. If you have a child coming to you for treatment in any kind of setting, and I don't care whether it's psychiatric, family practice, anything, and abuse is being disclosed to you by that patient, whether it's them themselves being neglected or hit or abused, which often definitely coincide and go with domestic violence, and they're witnessing domestic violence, that's emotional abuse in and of itself, definitely scarring and traumatizing to anybody, especially a young child with a forming brain. You have a responsibility to be reporting that. You have a responsibility to sit your patient down and say, I hear you. I see this. This is not okay. To go one step further, while it is not the doctor's responsibility or some other outsider's responsibility to apologize for said trauma, because they are not they didn't do this to them, it goes a really long way to sit down a victim, a survivor, and say, I'm sorry. I know I didn't do this to you, but you need to hear this. I'm sorry that happened to you. Because the odds of them getting that from the perpetrator are very, very slim. But simply hearing that touches something deep within humans that is innate, that lets us kind of breathe that sigh of relief and go, you did hear me. You saw me. You saw the trauma. You saw the experience, and you helped me just by listening, just by acknowledging. Um, when you have a doctor who's refusing to do that, when you have people around you who are refusing to do that, how do you expect somebody like Adam to get better? How do you expect somebody like Adam to not struggle as an adult in his interpersonal relationships? How do you expect anything other than needing to still constantly go to the doctor and be medicated because there's symptoms that aren't getting treated? Um, Studies have shown that when it comes to this, to borderline personality disorder, especially when it's linked with childhood trauma, yes, you can medicate BPD. Yes, it can be successful. Sometimes it can be very successful. You need the trauma therapy piece. You put those two together, the success rates are amazing. Some people don't require medication at all. They just need the therapy. A lot of people need both. But somebody who starts off in that arena with borderline personality disorder and the trauma, they can seem very, very broken, very emotionally unstable, even volatile at times. Obviously, going through trauma therapy is extremely hard work on both the patient and the doctor, the therapist, the psychiatrist, whoever it happens to be that is doing this therapy with them, which is why they need to be trauma informed so they know what the heck they're doing and they don't screw it up and re-traumatize them. You combine those two together, you can see astronomical changes in your patient. So much to the point that if you have a patient who has required medication at the beginning, they may be able to go off that medication. They may go on to function quite normally. You might go from somebody who you very well can tell has something wrong with them, has this BPD, to somebody who's very high functioning in society, who's in the army, who can go after their dreams, who can have successful interpersonal relationships, who can get married and not be worried that their mental, I don't really want to call them issues, their mental trauma is not going to negate their ability to be a spouse. That's not what they should be having to worry about. Especially when, to quote Adam, he knew I was experiencing trauma because it was in plain sight. This isn't an assumption. This isn't, I hinted that I was traumatized, that I was being traumatized. This is, I told you, Dr. Eric Milliner, that I was traumatized. You ignored me. He talked about that the abuse mostly landed on his mother. He had to hear it. He had to watch it. Those are very traumatizing experiences for anybody to go through. Imagine the terror and the fear of a child listening and seeing their mother getting beaten, getting screamed at, getting threatened. How could you not expect to have emotional backlash of that? How can you expect there to not be trauma, to not be a problem? You compound that with a doctor knowing that this is happening, a mandated reporter, a decent human being, hopefully, perhaps. And instead of being like, I need to step in here. I need to do something about this. Even if all I can myself guarantee is letting this person know that I know, letting them know that it's not okay, letting them know that they're not invisible, letting them know that I see them and that I hear them. That's what Dr. Eric Milliner should have been doing. From what I've gathered, like I said, this is Adam's not the only patient to have experienced this. There are many others out there like him. And people need to be held accountable. It's not fair and it's not okay that not only do abusers get away with things like this, but the people that we're supposed to depend on in our communities and our societies to help us perpetuate this cycle with no consequences. When you're a doctor, you take a Hippocratic oath. You carry a burden. You volunteer to carry a burden, especially in psychiatry. That's definitely the one field where if you have somebody coming to you with this, you should be stepping up to the plate. That's the least you can do. It would be nice if at some point Adam could get an apology from Dr. Milliner. Because, obviously he's been in practice for a very long time. I think it said like 30 plus years. Not that back then less education is an excuse, because mandated reporting is mandated reporting, abuse is abuse. That hasn't changed. But if he could at least go back and acknowledge and be like, you know what? I might not have been so great at my job. I don't know if I still might not be great at my job. And acknowledge that. To say, I messed up. I am sorry that I had a negative effect on your life. I'm sorry that I perpetuated your trauma, that I re-traumatized you, that I continued your cycle of abuse, that my only gumption was to line my pocket with big pharma and shove pills down your throat, because that was easier than acknowledging your trauma. Because let's face it, who really wants to acknowledge trauma? It's not fun. There's no big bucks in that. There's no attaboy quota pushing this new pill down your throat payoff in acknowledging trauma. That's talk therapy. Yeah, it's expensive. But if your patients get better, there goes your money. So let's keep people ill. Let's keep them traumatized so we can keep making bucks. So I hope in some way sharing Adam's story not only helps him, lets him know that even if he's not heard by Dr. Milliner, I heard you. I see you. I understand you. So sorry that this happened to you. It wasn't okay. It never will be okay. Not just from the standpoint of what your father did. That definitely was not okay. It's definitely not okay either what that doctor did. Doctors like Dr. Milliner should not be practicing in this field if this is how incompetently they're going to treat their patients. If you're not going to be trauma informed, if you're not going to do the full job, step aside and don't do it at all. Dr. Milliner, you owe Adam an apology. The least you can do is tell him you're sorry, that you messed up. Acknowledge that you messed up. Acknowledge that you contributed to his trauma. Because nobody should have to deal with that. Nobody should be in their 30s going, Rochester Mayo is just passing me around because it's too hard to acknowledge my childhood trauma. If you know somebody like Adam, acknowledging them goes a long way. You can't fix their trauma. You can't wave a magic eraser and make that go away. You can make it better, though, by telling them that you see them, telling them that you see their trauma, telling them that you're sorry for their trauma, that they shouldn't have experienced that. That's how you help them heal. That's how you help them start to heal. That's how you help them reach out to find the resources that are better than Dr. Milliner, that are better than Rochester Mayo, so they can begin their journey to mental wellness, so that they can finally be freed from this horrible bird cage that they have been trapped in for most of their life. Nobody deserves to live that way. Adam, I hope this helps you. I wish you the best of luck on your journey with your girlfriend. I hope that this is the beginning of change for you. Um, I hope it helps you to know that your trauma is acknowledged. Your trauma is valid. Your trauma is not okay. I hope it helps you to know that Dr. Eric Milliner of Rochester Mayo has been called out. Even if he never tells you he's sorry, even if he never fixes what he did, I hope that there is at least some snippet of healing in this for you. Um, because I appreciate you telling me your story. I appreciate you being brave enough to share it with me. I appreciate you being brave enough to share it with the world, because your voice is powerful and your voice matters. It always will. Don't let